Even the mainstream media has been talking about central bank digital currencies.
I told you it was coming. I said they'd go for central bank digital currencies.
The United States Federal Reserve is considering the creation of a digital dollar.
And we all know how a CBDC could turn our lives into Orwellian nightmares. But I've got a shocking revelation for you. I don't think the Fed will issue the CBDC. I think it may be JP Morgan. And I'm going to reveal this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over who actually owns the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve System is a network of 12 banks in different regions throughout the United States. Obviously, the New York Fed is the main hub. That's the main central bank. And each one of these reserve banks are individually operated, and they're individually owned by the member banks within the region. So let's just take the New York Fed for an example. Let's say the only 3 banks in the region right now were JP Morgan, Citibank, and Goldman Sachs. So the New York Fed would issue shares, stocks, to these banks based on their size. Now, these aren't exact numbers, but just to give you an idea of the concept. So let's just assume for a moment that out of these 3, JP Morgan is the biggest. So they would have 50% of the outstanding shares, Citibank 30%, and Goldman Sachs 20%. To understand this even better, editor, let's go right to the internet.
So we go straight to the Federal Reserve's website, and you notice right off the bat in their FAQs here, they've got a question, who owns the Federal Reserve? And they come right out in the first sentence, and they say the Federal Reserve System is not owned by anyone, you tinfoil hatter, conspiracy theorist. But then, in the exact same blog post, they go on to say, for instance, each of the 12 reserve banks operates within its own particular geographic area or district of the United States, and each is separately incorporated. Incorporated? Weird. Last time I checked, if you were incorporated, you would have an owner, but let's keep going. And has its own board of directors. Commercial banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System hold stock in their district reserve bank. Okay, so if they hold the stock, last time I checked, the shareholders were the owner of the corporation. They go on to say, however, owning reserve bank stock is quite different from owning stock in a private company. So don't get them confused, you tinfoil hatter. The reserve banks are not operated for profit, and ownership of certain amount of stock is, by law, a condition of membership in the system. So let me get this straight. What they're saying is these shares that the banks own, they don't really mean anything. They don't do anything. They're just completely irrelevant. But you have to own them to be a member. Well, they don't mean anything. Then why do you have to own them? And I know right about now your friend and family member Fred is going to say, oh, George, you don't even know what you're talking about. Look right here in their blog post. They specifically say that they are not operated for profit. I mean, they give all the money to the U.S. Treasury, except for paying for necessary expenses, which they don't define. And they do pay a dividend, and they have to maintain a limited balance in a surplus fund. Okay, well, let's think that one through. First of all, this is just like any other business where the owner runs as many expenses that they can. They run their private jet, their yacht, their mansion through the business and say, oh, it didn't make any profit, IRS. Well, it's a non-for-profit. Yeah, but it just very conveniently happens to pay you about $5 million a year. They're also legally required to pay their member banks a dividend. Okay, when's the last time you went to the gym and instead of you having to pay them dues, they paid you a dividend? That never happens. Why? Because you don't own the gym. That's why. It's so blatantly obvious that these member banks own the Federal Reserve regardless of what they say. And it gets even better. Look at this last line. And maintaining a limited balance in a surplus fund. Okay, right. So why does the Federal Reserve need a surplus fund? They print money. They create money. They create bank reserves. They can have negative equity. Why on earth do they need a surplus fund? If not a slush fund for the member banks that don't own the Federal Reserve and magically, mysteriously have to own shares that pay them dividends. So the bottom line here is this is a complete ruse. They're just trying to pull the wool over your eyes, and they've been successful at doing it for over 100 years. But the banksters themselves are calling the shots. And even if you want to argue that, oh no, George, the Federal Reserve is controlled by the government, okay, fine. Well, who controls the politicians? That would be the banksters, more specifically, Jamie Dimon that runs JP Morgan.
So regardless of how much pretzel logic the mainstream media, the Federal Reserve, and the politicians want to use, whomever owns the most shares owns the Fed. And the biggest bank is the one that owns the most shares. And who do you think that would be? You guessed it, JP Morgan. And is it any surprise when you go back a couple weeks and look at the sweetheart deal they got with First Republic? We're going to go over that in just a moment. This deal could only be done by someone who controlled not just the politicians, but most likely controlled the central bank and the Treasury. Now let's take it one step further. Let's assume for a moment that Goldman Sachs and Citi go bust, or that JP Morgan just acquires them by borrowing money from the taxpayer. That would mean that all of their assets go to JP Morgan. But their assets also include the shares they own of the central bank. More on that in just a moment. Now, I know right about now, a lot of you that are really paying attention are watching this video and saying, okay, George, I get it. The banksters own the Fed. Nothing new there. But the Fed right now is losing money. So why are the banksters like Jamie Dimon allowing that to happen if they own the Fed? Maybe it is true that the Fed is completely independent. Well, let's go ahead and walk through that. First of all, we got the balance sheet for the New York Fed right here, assets on the left, liabilities on the right. Let's just assume for a moment they are making 2% on their assets and they're paying 5% on their liabilities. This would be the example that you were referring to where the Fed is actually losing money. Okay, well, why are they losing money? Because they're paying more on their liabilities. Well, what are their liabilities? The bank reserves for JP Morgan. So if the Fed is losing money, that means that JP Morgan is making more money through interest on reserves. And if the Fed is making more on the asset side than the liability side of their balance sheet, that means that JP Morgan is making more money on the profit from the Federal Reserve. So regardless of whether the Fed makes money or loses money, JP Morgan comes out smelling like roses. Heads, I win. Tails, you lose. Step number 2. Now let's go over the dirty little secrets behind this First Republic deal and what it reveals about JP Morgan. If you listen to the mainstream media, you'll hear that this was an aggressive bidding war between all these banks for the assets of First Republic. And JP Morgan just barely won because they were the ones that were able to sacrifice the most, and they were the ones that were willing to take the most amount of risk.
The reason JP Morgan had emerged as the biggest bidder here and the most successful is because, as we know it, that the cost to the deposit insurance fund for the FDIC was the least under a JP Morgan acquisition.
So if you listen to the mainstream media, it sounds like we should be thanking Jamie Dimon for being such a public servant. Okay, well, let's go ahead and scratch beneath the surface and go over some of the details of the actual deal. First and foremost, the FDIC guarantees most of the losses. So let's just assume that JP Morgan absorbs First Republic, which they did. Well, they take all their assets, they take all their liabilities. So let's assume that those assets aren't the greatest, such as some toxic sludge, aka commercial real estate. Well, what the FDIC is saying is, Jamie, yeah, don't worry about that. We'll go ahead and we'll absorb those losses for you. So the only thing you have to worry about is how much profit you're going to make from the deal. And this is according to an article from CNBC. But they go on to say that it's not just the FDIC taking the losses. They're also lending JP Morgan $50 billion to do the deal. Oh, but wait, there is more. The estimate to what JP Morgan will make per year from this transaction is $500 million. And that doesn't include what they've already made from the deal, which would be $2.6 billion. So mainstream media, you're going to tell me that that was the best deal the FDIC could get. That was the deal that cost them the least. And you're also going to sit here and tell me that no other banks were willing to step up to the plate and say, okay, well, we'll take a little bit of a haircut and we don't need to make $500 million a year. We'll go ahead and make $450 million. And that no other banks were willing to step up and do this deal to take a one-time gain of $2.5 billion instead of $2.6 billion. Come on. Who are you trying to kid? This is absolutely ridiculous. This is a scam. And they're just trying to pull the wool over your eyes. I mean, for heaven's sakes, even the average Joe right here is laughing at how ridiculous this whole ruse actually is. In reality, what most likely happened is Jamie Dimon just got on the phone with Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen and whatever lackey was over at the FDIC and said, hey guys, this is how the deal is going to go down. And they just said, yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. No problem, sir. We'll make it happen. You'll have the deal on your desk along with that $2.6 billion by Monday morning. Let me give you a quick visual and show you how this works. So we've got bank A, B, and C. Their customers are obviously pretty pissed. Why are they pissed off? Because they know the banks are ripping them off. They're nickel and diming them to death. So the banks take those fees right out of their customers' pockets and they give them to the FDIC. And what does the FDIC do with the money that the banks took from their customers? Well, they give that straight to JP Morgan. So how can they get away with this? Well, it's actually pretty easy when you actually own the central bank and all of the politicians. It's a great business model, isn't it? Oh, but wait, there is more. Let's remember that we've got a global monetary system that's run by the banks themselves. And you guys know from watching my videos that this monetary system broke in 2008. It's never been fixed, and it's getting progressively worse. So if we've got a broken monetary system that's, let's say, running on 4 cylinders instead of 8 cylinders, and in the future, that's going to go down to running on 3 cylinders, 2 cylinders, 1 cylinder, before it completely collapses, it's easy to see how, in that type of environment, how banks would continue to go bust. We saw what happened in 2008. Now in 2023, the banking failures, even when you adjust for inflation, have exceeded the great financial crisis. And we're only in May. We've still got another 7 months of potential bank failures within this year. But my point is, if this system is broken, we should expect that it's going to get far worse before it gets better. That means banks are going to continue to go bust. And if they continue to go bust, what we've seen in 2023 is most of them will go over to JP Morgan. They will take all of their shares. So Jamie Dimon's ownership in the Federal Reserve will increase as well. It's basically like a Highlander movie where you've got to kill all the other people and you're the only one left standing. Except for this time, it's a banking version of Highlander. Step number 3. So how do we go from worrying about Fed coin to now having to worry about J coin? In other words, JP Morgan being the issuer of the central bank digital currency we're all worried about. We're going to go over that, but before we do, I want to ask you a quick question. When was the world's first central bank digital currency set up? When was it created? Was it 5 years ago? Was it a year ago? 10 years ago? Wrong. Try 100 years ago. Over 100 years ago in 1922. We're going to go over that central bank digital currency in just a moment. But let's get right back to the whiteboard. So after JPM and Jamie Dimon take out all the other banks and win the banking version of Highlander, then they will own all of the shares of the Federal Reserve System. And if they own all of the shares, then that means that they are 100% owner. So what you have is this merger where the central bank and the commercial bank, the only one left standing, are basically the exact same thing. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not saying that this is going to happen in 2023. I think we're going to take a big step in that direction. But if we look out 10 or 15 years, is this idea that crazy? I don't think so, especially when you consider the fragility of today's global monetary system. All right, so let's go ahead and think this through. If JP Morgan is the last man standing, then they would have all of the deposits, all the individuals, the entities in the U.S. economy would be on their balance sheet. That would be a liability on their balance sheet, even if the Fed had the liabilities of JP Morgan's bank reserves. Remember, they've basically merged into one giant mega bank. And if, or maybe when that happens, we will have a central bank digital currency. Now, I know a lot of you right about now are saying, whoa, time out, George. You must have skipped a lot of steps to this video. How do you go from JP Morgan being the only bank to a central bank digital currency? That doesn't make any sense at all. They're probably still using the dollar. They don't have some completely different currency. But you're missing my point. Let me explain further. Editor, let's go right to the internet, where we'll see the first central bank digital currency was set up in 1922.
We're going to start by going to Wikipedia and check out the Russian central bank. It used to be called Gazbank. So the state bank of the old USSR was the central bank of the Soviet Union and the only bank in the entire country from 1922 to 1991. So basically, they had the exact same system in communist Russia that I was describing back on the whiteboard, assuming that JP Morgan wins the banking version of Highlander. But check this out. The Soviet state used Gazbank primarily as a tool to impose centralized control upon industry in general, using bank balances and transaction histories to monitor the activity of individual concerns and their compliance with 5-year plans and directives of the government. Sounds exactly like a central bank digital currency, doesn't it? But let's keep going. Bank did not act as a commercial bank in regard to profit motive. It acted theoretically as an instrument of government policy. Instead of independently and impartially assessing the credit worthiness of a borrower, Bank would provide loan funds to favored individuals, groups, and industries as directed by the central government. So pretty much all your concerns about a CBDC we saw come to fruition in 1922. Well, how was this done? Did they have the type of technology back then that we have today? No, absolutely not. The reason they were able to achieve this Orwellian nightmare is because all the deposits were on one ledger.
So hopefully by now you guys can see the main point I'm trying to make in this video. None of us want a CBDC. None of us want that Orwellian nightmare. The government micromanaging every single part of your life. But what we have to focus on when we're pushing back against the central planners and the authoritarians isn't necessarily something called a CBDC. It's simply moving all the deposits onto one ledger. That is what we have to avoid at all costs. So why is this distinction so important? Why is it absolutely crucial for us prevailing and actually winning in this fight for freedom, liberty, and our privacy? Because I think the central planners, the Klaus Schwab types, the IMF, the politicians, the UN, the EU, etc., they're not stupid. And they understand that this term has negative connotations, got very bad PR. So if they want to achieve their Orwellian dream, which is our Orwellian nightmare, they're not going to come right out and say, hey, we're implementing this thing called FedCoin or even Jcoin. What they're going to do is they're going to say, hey, for your safety, for your security, we need to move all of these deposits onto one ledger. And all those people that are hyper-focused on a CBDC are going to sit there and say, oh yeah, okay, Jerome Powell, okay, Jamie Dimon, you do whatever you have to do. Yeah, you need to secure my deposit so I don't take a haircut. Yeah, that's fine. But whatever you do, don't do that CBDC. And they sit back and say, oh, no, we would never dream of doing that. And then that same average Joe wakes up 6 months later and all of a sudden they've got a social score. And all of a sudden, even though they have a 750 credit score, they can't get a mortgage. But that other person that has a 500 credit score can. There's an old saying, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Well, now I think we could say the greatest trick the central planners and authoritarians have ever pulled, whether it's intentional or not, is convincing the world a CBDC does exist. It's not the central bank digital currency we should be worried about. It's the central bank digital ledger system. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.